Let me tell you something about recessions. They never announce their arrival. They slip in quietly like a draft under the door until one morning you wake up and realize the warmth is gone. The headlines will blame a virus, an oil price, a policy mistake, or a war. But those are only the sparks. The real fire starts long before, in years of cheap money, easy credit, and the comforting illusion that tomorrow will look just like today, only richer. Every generation believes it has outsmarted the cycle. Every generation learns it hasn't. We've built an economy that runs beautifully in sunshine, but wobbles the moment the weather changes. Why? Because too often we trade discipline for convenience, prudence for profit, and patience for promises. And then when the bill arrives, we look around for someone to blame: the bankers, the government, the markets, when in truth the problem is deeper than all of them. It's in the habits, incentives, and short-term thinking that define how we live, borrow, and invest. So tonight, let's strip away the noise and talk plainly. What really causes a recession? Why do small cracks turn into collapses? And more importantly, how do we fix it? Not with slogans or quick fixes, but with principles that endure. Because if we can understand the cause, we can prevent the cure from becoming another mistake. And perhaps, just perhaps, we can build an economy that bends in the wind but never breaks. The real cause of most recessions isn't a mystery buried in an economic theory. It's the same old story of human behavior meeting easy money. When interest rates stay low for too long, when credit is abundant and cheap, people start to believe risk no longer exists. Borrowers take on debt they shouldn't, lenders loosen their standards, and investors chase returns far beyond reason. It starts with optimism, always does, and ends with regret, because every period of abundance plants the seeds of its own correction. The economy, like nature, has seasons. When we stretch summer too long with artificial sunshine, the winter that follows is colder and harsher than it needs to be. This cycle of credit and debt, repeated over generations, is the central engine behind most recessions. Cheap money encourages leverage. Leverage fuels speculation. Speculation inflates prices beyond their true value. And once the air gets thin enough at the top, the smallest pinprick, a rate hike, a policy change, a shock from abroad, can deflate the entire structure. You see it in housing markets that outpace wages, in stock markets that rise faster than corporate profits, in companies borrowing not to invest in innovation, but to buy back their own shares. These are the quiet signals that the cycle is turning from productive expansion to dangerous excess. For a while, it all feels fine. Credit creates the illusion of prosperity. New homes rise, markets surge, consumers spend freely. Everyone feels richer. Politicians point to the numbers and call it success. But beneath that surface, the foundation weakens. The debt load builds up like hidden cracks in the walls, unseen until they split wide open. A household can only spend so long on borrowed money before the bills come due. So can an economy. When the cycle reverses, when interest rates climb and credit tightens, those same debts that once looked manageable become suffocating. And just like that, optimism turns to fear, leverage turns to losses, and liquidity vanishes. The tragedy isn't that people fail to see it coming, it's that they refuse to believe it while it's happening. Warnings about bubbles always sound pessimistic in good times. No one wants to stop the music when everyone's still dancing, but the rhythm never lasts. Eventually, lenders pull back, asset prices fall, and borrowers begin to default. What follows is not just a financial correction, it's a psychological one. Confidence collapses faster than credit, and what was once a healthy economy begins to spiral downward. Banks tighten standards, companies cancel hiring, consumers save instead of spend. The system, which once thrived on momentum, grinds to a halt. You could blame the bankers, the speculators, the central bankers, or the regulators. In truth, it's a collective failure, a cycle of human overconfidence repeating itself. Every generation convinces itself that this time is different, that new technology, new policy tools, or smarter experts have finally conquered the cycle. But the basic ingredients of excess never change. Too much borrowed money, too little discipline, and too much belief in the permanence of growth. That's the real cause. Not some mysterious force of fate, but a pattern of choices made by people who forget that debt has limits and prices don't rise forever. The cure, if there is one, lies in remembering the old truths before they're proven again the hard way. Sensible credit, steady savings, prudent investment, and an economy built on real productivity, not borrowed time or what sustained growth. But when speculation replaces stewardship, when financial engineering replaces real enterprise, the results are always the same. We can't control the cycles entirely, but we can certainly make them less destructive by curbing the excess that fuels them, because every bubble, every bust, every so-called unexpected recession is simply the bill coming due for a party that went on too long. Recessions rarely arise from a single cause. Often they're the result of a slow buildup of vulnerabilities, excess debt, inflated asset prices, overconfidence that finally meet an external shock or a policy mistake. The economy, like any machine, can run smoothly for years, but when one or two critical parts start to fail under pressure, the entire system feels it. And when that pressure comes in the form of a policy misstep or a global disruption, the damage can be swift and severe. Monetary policy sits at the center of this. It's the steering wheel of the economy, delicate, sensitive, and dangerous to overuse. When interest rates are too low for too long, the economy overheats and investors chase risky returns. When rates rise too quickly, the brakes lock and the wheels stop turning. Finding the balance between stimulus and restraint has never been easy. Tightening policy, raising interest rates, or reducing the money supply may be necessary to fight inflation, but when done aggressively or at the wrong time, it can tip a fragile economy into recession. History is filled with such moments. The early 1980s, when rates shot up to crush inflation and unemployment soared, the late 2000s, when housing excess met tighter credit, or even recent years when rapid hikes strained banks holding long-term bonds that lost value overnight. The truth is, monetary tightening is a blunt instrument. It cools demand, but it also cools confidence. It makes borrowing costlier for businesses, mortgages harder for families, and investment less appealing for entrepreneurs. For strong economies, these are manageable headwinds. But for economies already burdened with high debt or fragile banking systems, those same headwinds can become hurricanes. A financial sector built on leverage cannot easily absorb higher rates. Losses appear, liquidity dries up, and credit contracts. And once credit slows, the rest of the economy follows. But not every downturn comes from policy. Sometimes it's the world itself that delivers the blow. Large negative supply shocks are among the most painful forces an economy can face. Think of oil price spikes that ripple through every factory and transport system, raising costs before wages can catch up, or a pandemic that halts production, disrupts supply chains, and changes consumer behavior overnight, or a trade war where tariffs raise prices, cut export demand, and erode business confidence. These shocks strike the real economy. They make things cost more, make goods harder to find, and leave policymakers in a bind, stimulate demand and risk inflation, or tighten policy and risk a deeper contraction. The most dangerous situation is when these shocks hit an already fragile financial system. It's one thing for supply chains to tighten, it's another for the credit system to seize up at the same time. When banks and investors are overexposed to risk, small disruptions can escalate into systemic crises. A spike in energy prices can trigger defaults. Defaults can lead to margin calls. Margin calls can lead to forced selling. And before long, fear spreads faster than the problem itself. In those moments, panic is not economic, it's psychological. People stop spending, stop lending, and start hoarding. Recessions deepen not because of numbers on a chart, but because of a collapse in trust. It's easy to blame the policymakers for acting too soon or too late. But the truth is more complicated. Every decision is made in uncertainty. No one knows the precise point where inflation turns into stagnation or where growth tips into decline. But the lesson, time and again, is that timing and communication matter as much as the policy itself. Slow, predictable adjustments give businesses and households time to adapt. Sudden, sharp moves breed confusion and fear. A central bank that overreacts can do as much harm as one that hesitates. The only real safeguard against these errors and shocks is resilience. A financial system and an economy strong enough to absorb blows without collapsing. That means prudent lending, disciplined public finances, diversified energy sources, and realistic expectations about what policy can achieve. It means remembering that stability is not built in times of crisis, but in the calm years before it. If we allow excess fragility and short-term thinking to dominate, no amount of clever policy making will save us when the next shock arrives. In the end, recessions born of policy errors or supply shocks are reminders of humility. We cannot control every variable, but we can control our preparation. A sound economy is not one that never faces shocks. It's one that can withstand them. And when we focus less on prediction and more on preparation, we trade fragility for endurance and panic for patience. A recession rarely begins with a thunderclap. It often starts with something small, a missed payment here, a dip in housing prices there, a loss of confidence somewhere else. On its own, such a tremor shouldn't topple an economy. But when that economy is loaded with leverage, when debts are high and assets are priced for perfection, even a small shock can grow into a storm. This is the financial accelerator at work, the cruel mechanism that turns modest corrections into deep recession. Here's how it happens. In good times, credit expands easily. Borrowers use rising asset values, homes, stocks, commercial properties, as collateral to borrow more. Lenders, confident that collateral will hold its value, keep lending. The system reinforces itself. Credit lifts prices, and higher prices justify more credit. It's a comfortable illusion that prosperity can feed endlessly on itself. But prosperity built on leverage is fragile. The moment asset values start to fall, the same self-reinforcing cycle runs backward only faster. When collateral values decline, lenders grow cautious. They tighten credit terms, call in loans, or demand additional security. Borrowers, facing pressure, sell assets to meet obligations, but those sales push prices down further, destroying more collateral value and prompting more selling. What began as a small correction becomes a cascade. Businesses that once had easy access to credit find the doors suddenly closed. Households with debt struggle to refinance. Investment slows, hiring freezes, and spending dries up. Demand falls precisely when it's needed most. This is how leverage magnifies loss. In theory, a 1% decline in asset values might seem minor, but when that asset is supporting 10 times as much borrowed money, the impact is devastating. The financial sector, which should act as a bridge between savers and borrowers, becomes a bottleneck. Banks and investors, anxious to protect themselves, pull back from lending just when liquidity is most essential. Credit intermediation, the quiet plumbing of the economy, becomes clogged. Without credit, even sound businesses can't function. And when credit dries up, confidence follows. The contagion spreads quickly because markets are tightly connected. One sector's distress becomes another's problem. Falling property prices hit construction and materials. Declining stock values hurt retirement funds, dampening consumer confidence. Struggling borrowers lead to bank losses, forcing banks to retrench, which in turn reduces credit to everyone else. The chain reaction moves faster than most realize because it runs on emotion as much as economics. Fear feeds on itself, and in finance, fear is contagious. By the time policymakers respond, the damage is often done. Stimulus can soften the blow, but restoring confidence takes far longer than losing it. That's why the best defense against this kind of spiral is prevention. Keeping leverage moderate, ensuring credit standards remain sound, and building transparency into the system so risks are visible before they metastasize. Because once the financial accelerator kicks in, momentum is hard to reverse. The economy doesn't need a major disaster to collapse. It only needs the wrong conditions for fear to multiply. And when trust erodes, even small cracks in the system can widen into deep recession. The lesson is simple but too often ignored. Stability built on debt is not real stability at all. When a recession strikes, time becomes the most valuable commodity. The difference between a short downturn and a long depression often comes down to speed. How quickly a society can act to stop temporary shocks from becoming permanent scars. Because when jobs vanish, businesses close and confidence collapses, the damage doesn't just appear in numbers on a chart. It shows up in the faces of workers who can't find new opportunities, in families forced to spend savings they took years to build, and in communities hollowed out by closures and uncertainty. That is why the response must be timely, targeted, and thoughtful. Not frantic, not careless, but decisive. The first tool is monetary liquidity, making sure credit continues to flow. In a crisis, fear is contagious, and the first instinct of financial institutions is to pull back. Banks hold on to cash, lenders tighten terms, and liquidity evaporates. Without intervention, that paralysis spreads through the entire economy. The central bank's job at such a moment is not to enrich speculators or prop up asset prices, but to keep the plumbing of finance from freezing solid by injecting liquidity through lower interest rates, open market operations, or emergency lending. It ensures that businesses can still meet payroll, households can refinance, and the financial gears keep turning. Liquidity is the oxygen of an economy under stress. Without it, even healthy firms can suffocate. But liquidity alone is not enough. It can stabilize markets, but it cannot restore livelihoods. That's where targeted fiscal support comes in. Governments must act as a stabilizer of last resort, spending when private activity stalls and investing where fear has frozen initiative. The support must be directed toward those most likely to spend it, not hoard it. Workers who lost jobs, small businesses on the brink, local services under pressure. Well-targeted fiscal action creates a bridge, a temporary bridge, between the shock and the recovery. Keeps consumers afloat so demand doesn't collapse entirely. It prevents a healthy business from closing permanently just because it couldn't survive 3 bad months. And by doing so, it preserves the foundation for recovery once confidence returns. Automatic stabilizers are the quiet heroes of this process. Unlike emergency bailouts or hastily written rescue packages, they don't require debate or political delay. They're built into the system. Progressive taxes that fall when incomes drop, unemployment insurance that rises when layoffs mount, safety nets that activate when need surges. These mechanisms don't eliminate recessions, but they soften their blow and reduce the lag between problem and response. They are, in a sense, the economy's shock absorbers. When designed properly, they prevent the spiral of panic and poverty that deepens downturns and prolongs recovery. Speed matters, but so does precision. Flooding the system with untargeted money can create distortions that outlast the crisis, inflated asset prices, moral hazard, and a widening gap between those who benefit first and those who suffer longest. The goal should not be to rescue every balance sheet, but to protect the essential functions of the real economy, jobs, production, and basic financial trust. Support should taper as conditions improve, ensuring that emergency policies don't become permanent crutches. Recovery should be built on restored demand, not endless intervention. And through it all, communication is key. People can handle hardship if they understand the plan and believe in its fairness. What destroys confidence is confusion, when citizens see bailouts for the reckless while the careful are left behind. Transparency and accountability are not luxuries in a crisis, they are the foundation of trust. The right short-term response to a recession isn't about theatrics or perfect forecasts. It's about common sense. Keep money moving, protect those who cannot protect themselves, and act quickly enough that temporary shocks don't become lasting scars. Because every lost job that could have been saved, every small business that could have survived, is not just an economic statistic, it's a story of potential cut short. When we respond with speed, fairness, and focus, we don't just protect markets, we protect people, and that ultimately is what makes recovery real. Once a recession passes, the temptation is always the same: to breathe a sigh of relief, patch up the damage, and return to business as usual. But that instinct is precisely what ensures we'll face the same crisis again. Real stability isn't built in the middle of chaos, it's built quietly in the years that follow when the memory of pain begins to fade. The question isn't how to rescue an economy once it's fallen, it's how to build one strong enough not to collapse under its own excess. That means tackling the roots of fragility: too much debt, too little discipline, and too many incentives for short-term gain at long-term cost. The first step is to strengthen macro-prudential regulation, the safeguards that prevent finance from turning reckless. Rules alone don't create stability, but they can create boundaries that curb our worst impulses. Banks, lenders, and corporations must operate with adequate capital buffers, stress tests that reflect reality, and limits on leverage that stop speculation before it spreads. It isn't about stifling innovation or punishing profit. It's about keeping the system honest. Financial markets will always look for ways to chase yield, but strong oversight ensures that the pursuit of return doesn't threaten the foundation of the economy itself. If risk-taking is left unchecked, it becomes collective risk, and collective risk, when it fails, always falls hardest on ordinary people. Reducing excessive leverage across households, corporations, and governments is equally essential. Debt can be productive when it funds real growth, but destructive when it fuels consumption or speculation. For families, that means living within means borrowing for education or homes, not lifestyles. For corporations, it means focusing on innovation and productivity rather than endless debt finance, stock buybacks, or mergers. that serve executives more than the economy. And for governments, it means keeping fiscal discipline in good times so there's room to act in bad ones. High leverage is a quiet trap. It looks manageable until conditions change. Then it turns from a tool of growth into a chain of constraint. Reducing it before the next downturn is the only way to make recovery faster and less painful. Credible monetary and fiscal frameworks form the backbone of long-term confidence. People, markets, and institutions must believe that inflation will stay under control, that governments will meet their obligations, and that the rules won't shift with every political win. Credibility isn't earned through rhetoric, it's earned through consistency. A central bank that acts predictably and communicates clearly can guide expectations without swinging a hammer. A fiscal authority that saves in prosperity can spend freely in crisis without inviting panic. Together, these policies anchor stability. When people trust the framework, they plan, invest, and spend, and confidence itself becomes a stabilizing force. The broader goal is moderation, not eliminating business cycles, but softening their extremes. Booms should be smaller, less shallower. Growth should be steady, not euphoric. This can't be achieved through wishful thinking. It requires a culture that prizes prudence over excitement and stewardship over speculation. An economy driven by long-term investment, real productivity, and fair competition is far less likely to collapse under pressure. None of this is glamorous. It's slow, deliberate work, the kind of work that rarely makes headlines. But that's the point. Sound systems don't draw attention. They simply function. If we want recoveries that are quick and recessions that are mild, we must stop building economies that depend on perpetual risk-taking. The next crisis won't be avoided by luck or clever speech. It will be avoided by the unglamorous virtues that once built prosperity: restraint, transparency, accountability, and a willingness to learn from our own mistakes. Because in the end, true progress isn't measured by how high we climb in the good times, but by how well we endure when the winds inevitably turn. The economy is not an abstract machine. It is a collection of human plans and hopes. We can let reckless credit and short-term greed pull those plans apart, or we can build rules and practices that protect them. The prescription is not complicated. Steady hands in a crisis, smarter rules in good times, and a single-minded devotion to the public interest over ephemeral profit. Do that, and the next recession will be shallower. Do that, and ordinary lives will be spared the brunt of extraordinary mistakes. That is how we fix it practically, honestly, and for the long run. Thank you.